So far, we've spent a lot of time talking about a lot of abiotic aspects of the system, or even when we've gotten the living things in, we've still kind of focused on what's happening with things like atoms and molecules and energy and things of that sort. So now what we need to do is we need to begin to focus a little more on the biotic or the living part of the ecosystem. And so now we're going to introduce our cast of characters, the living players in these things that we call ecosystems. And each one of these types of living things has a particular role that they play. Some groups have multiple roles, but they all have a role that they play in the system that allows the system to function. Okay, so these different groups of organisms, different types of organisms, they all have something important to contribute. In this particular image, we have things like mushrooms here. This is a nice little mushroom, and it's doing one thing in the ecosystem. We have all of this beautiful moss growing on the tree, and it has something very different to contribute to the ecosystem. Okay, but these two organisms, they actually are interacting and working together. And this is just a small example of the kinds of things that go on, kinds of things that living things do in the ecosystem. So this fairly short voice thread is going to introduce the characters, and we're going to give you a little bit of a preview of the roles that they play in the ecosystem. Way back in the Dark Ages, going back maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years, people were interested in studying the world. They were interested in understanding the world around them, and it was important for them to kind of categorize the world and try and organize the world and make sense out of it. Well, a couple 3,000 years ago, they pretty much categorized the world in the following way. Things were either plants, or they were animals, or they were rocks. And that's pretty much it. And that actually worked for quite a while, this idea of three general groups to which things can belong. However, as people began to study things, especially studying the plants and the animals, they began to realize that, you know, there's a lot of differences here, and we need to reevaluate how we look at the world around us. And so they decided to give the rocks to the geologists and just start dealing with plants and animals. And as they looked at the plants and they looked at the animals, they began to realize that there's more to it than just plants and animals. And so by the time we got to when I was taking general biology class, way back in the nether regions of the 1980s, we had something called the Five Kingdom System. There were 5 general groups to which things belong. Now, as we get into the early part of the 21st century, okay, we see that ideas have changed, and the way that we look at the living things has changed. And part of that change is things are more complicated than they used to be. So in order to keep this fairly manageable, I'm going to go back to my good old days of the 1980s, and we're going to look at 5 general groups of organisms and talk about their characteristics, and these are going to be our 5 groups of players, our 5 troops, and we're going to talk about the roles that these groups play in the ecosystem. We'll start out with a group that it's probably reasonable to say most of you have probably never heard of, and this is the kingdom Monera. The kingdom Monera. Now, the Monerans, they represent organisms that are generally single-celled. Occasionally, the cells will stick together, as we see in this image, but each cell is independent, so they're single-celled organisms, and also they have a very simple, relatively speaking, a simple internal structure. And that's what distinguishes the Monera from all of the other organisms that exist on the planet. Now, like I said, Monera, that's probably not a word that's in your vocabulary. But there's one general category of these things that we call the Monera that you probably have heard of. You've probably heard of something called bacteria. Okay, yeah, bacteria, E. coli, and things like that. Bacteria are one group of monerans, and the bacteria are really involved in the process of breaking things down. Bacteria are important in taking things apart, in dismantling things. We saw back in the nitrogen cycle, we had bacteria that took nitrogen molecules apart. Bacteria are important in cycling, and they're important in returning materials from the biotic or the living part of the ecosystem back to the abiotic or the non-living part of the ecosystem. So that's one group. There's another group that are kind of interesting. They're called the cyanobacteria, and cyan is a type of blue, so cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae. And what these guys do that's pretty important is they do photosynthesis. Okay, so we have some bacteria or some Monera that do photosynthesis. And these are the cyanobacteria or the blue-green algae. And they're going to be doing just kind of the opposite of what regular bacteria do. Since cyanobacteria do photosynthesis, and remember photosynthesis is putting together with light, they're putting things together. They're taking material from the abiotic part of the environment, the non-living part of the environment, and putting it together and bringing it into the biotic or the living part of the environment. So the kingdom Monera consists of single-celled organisms that have a simple internal structure. One general category of them are the bacteria, and another general category are the cyanobacteria, or sometimes called the blue-green algae. Their role is to break things down. In the case of bacteria, bacteria break down. Cyanobacteria, on the other hand, they do photosynthesis and they build up.
The next kingdom is the kingdom Protista. And the Protista are an awful lot like our friends of the Monera. Okay, Protista usually are single cells, just like the Monera. Okay, and here the Protista in this picture, this is a thing called an amoeba. Okay, amoebas, paramecium, things like that. They generally consist of single cells, but their other important characteristic is that they have a complex internal structure. Monera had a simple internal structure. Protista has a complex internal structure. And most of the Protista consists of single cells. Now, just like the Monera, some Protista are not green, they don't do photosynthesis, and we call those guys, like amoeba, sometimes you hear these fellows referred to as proto, P-R-O-T-O, zoa, the protozoans, okay, protozoa. All right, but some of these Protista are photosynthetic, and so we call the photosynthetic ones algae. Not blue-green algae, but just algae. So algae are photosynthetic protista. Now, the thing about algae is that sometimes the algae cells will stay connected together and they can form really big plant-like looking things. Stuff like seaweed. Okay, well technically seaweed is algae and it's put into the kingdom Protista. One of the main reasons for that is that even though it's a lot of cells together, they're not single-celled organisms. All of the cells are pretty much the same. There's not any real differences from one cell to the next. So they might as well be single cells for all practical purposes. So algae are photosynthetic protista. Protozoa are non-photosynthetic protista. The third kingdom consists of some really fun guys. Haha, get it? Fun guys. Okay. Anyway, this is the kingdom fungi. I pronounce it fungi. Some people pronounce it fungi. Okay, the kingdom fungi. Now, the thing about the kingdom fungi is that most of the fungi, most of the members of the kingdom fungi are multicellular. They are multicellular. That means they consist of hundreds or thousands or maybe even millions of cells, and those cells are interacting. Another important characteristic of the fungi is that none of them are photosynthetic. The fungi are all non-photosynthetic. I'll just put non-photo. They're non-photosynthetic. For a long time, they were grouped with the plants because they kind of look like the plants a little bit. They have this little stem here, and then they have this little top and so on. But they are not really like plants at all. And when you look at the details of how the cells are put together, and they're not like plants, and they're not like Protista, and they're not like Monera. They're different from everything. And none of the fungi does photosynthesis. They have to get their food from other things in their surroundings. Okay, so the kingdom fungi, multicellular, non-photosynthetic organisms that have a particular type of cellular structure. One of the things that one of those cellular structures is a cell wall. And interestingly enough, the cell wall of fungi is made out of the same material of all things, the exoskeletons of insects. Think about that the next time you chow down on some mushrooms. The fourth kingdom of life is, well, happens to be my favorite because it's the one that I devoted my studies to when I was in college, and that is the kingdom Plantae. And as you can see from this picture, we're talking about plants. And plants are multicellular, and most of them are photosynthetic. Okay? Multicellular photosynthetic organisms. And they also have cell walls, but their cell walls are composed of something called cellulose. Now, cellulose, that's a big long word. We can make that a little simpler. Cellulose is fiber. When they say you need more fiber in your diet, what do you eat? You eat plants because they got cellulose in them. That's fiber, and it's good for you. It keeps you regular and all that kind of stuff. Now, I said just a second ago that most plants are photosynthetic, but not all of them are. There are actually some plants out there. They're multicellular. They have cellulose cell walls, but they don't do photosynthesis. And in fact, what they do is they actually have specialized root-like structures that get into other plants and suck their juices. Sort of like vampire plants, vamp plants. And these are parasitic plants, and there are quite a number of them, even here in Tennessee. And as you go in your studies, you may come across some of those. You might want to look up an interesting one that you can often see a little bit later in the summer called, oops, I meant that to be orange. Let's go over here and grab some orange. Called Dodder, Dodder, the dodder. And the reason why I wanted to put it in orange like this is because that's what color it is. And the dodder plant will grow and twine and get up into these other plants like this, and it will suck their juices, suck them dry. Doesn't do a lick of photosynthesis on its own, but it's got pretty little flowers on it. In fact, the flowers of the dodder are in pretty little white clusters that occur along the stem, and they're actually quite attractive. Doesn't have any leaves, doesn't need any leaves, because it doesn't do photosynthesis. Ooh, that's really something. Last but not least, we have the kingdom of organisms that are multicellular, and they are non-photosynthetic. None of these guys ever, ever, ever do photosynthesis. And one more characteristic of these organisms, they're multicellular, they're non-photosynthetic, and they have none, zip, zero cell walls. And these guys are called kingdom Animalia, the animals. And here you see I have an example of a bird. Of course, it's not just any bird. Notice he has a brown head, and this happens to be a type of bird called a cowbird, and it's a cowbird with a brown head. And so the ornithologists, the people who study birds, gave it a very interesting name. They decided to call it the brown-headed cowbird. Now, I talk about brown-headed cowbirds right here because in another voice thread a little bit further on down the line, we're going to encounter these cowbirds again because they do something that's really sneaky and kind of underhanded, and well, it's just plain wrong. And you're going to go, man, how in the world they do that? Where'd that come from? Who would have thought that a bird would stoop to such low things as to do what brown-headed cowbirds do? Oh, it just is amazing. And you'll find out about that in another few voice threads. Okay, so here are all of our players in our ecosystems, and they all have roles to play. The organisms, and let me grab some green ink here, that do photosynthesis, the cyanobacteria, the algae, and the plants, their job is going to be getting materials from the non-living environment into the living environment. They make food. Okay? The Monera, the Monerans that are not photosynthetic, the bacteria and the fungi, their job is going to be to get materials from the living part of the system back to the non-living part of the system. We call these guys decomposers. Plants and algae and blue-green algae, they put things together. Bacteria and fungi take it apart again. Oops, well, we got these other guys over here, though. What about these guys? What about these animals? What do they do? Well, their job in the ecosystem is just to eat. They act as kind of the middle organism, almost said the middleman. The plants doing photosynthesis, they take matter and energy in, and then that matter and energy can flow through the animals. And eventually, though, the animals are going to end up being decomposed by the fungi, okay, over here, or by the Monera one way or another, and their matter and their energy is going to be cycled back to the non-living part of the environment. And we're going to see exactly how that happens in the next voice thread.